Imagine this. There is no word for love. Not because people don't feel it, but because no one has ever needed a word for it. You are not in a city. There are no roads. No houses. No written names. Only endless forests, open plains, and the sound of insects filling the night. It is more than 100,000 years ago. A small group of early humans sits around a fire. Beyond the circle of light, the darkness is complete. Inside that circle, something extraordinary is about to happen. One person looks at another and experiences a feeling unlike anything they have known before. It isn't fear. It isn't hunger. It isn't the instinct to survive. It is quieter than that. Their heartbeat changes. Their attention narrows. Suddenly, one person seems more important than everything else around them. Even the fire fades into the background. Even the dangers hiding in the darkness feel less urgent. But they don't understand what is happening. There is no language for this feeling. No stories about it and no history explaining it. So the brain does what early human brains always did. It searches for something familiar. Safety. Trust. Curiosity. But none of those explanations completely fit. Because this feeling is something new. And in that tiny moment, human evolution quietly changes direction. Not all at once. Not in a single night. But through a small shift in attention. One person begins to matter more than the rest of the world. That simple change will eventually reshape families, relationships, societies, and entire civilizations. But at the beginning, it is almost invisible. Here's what makes this story so fascinating. Love didn't suddenly appear because humans became more emotional. It emerged because the human brain was slowly changing. Generation after generation, our ancestors became more social, more cooperative, and more dependent on one another than any other species on Earth. Because surviving alone was nearly impossible. A single human standing in the wild had little chance against predators, harsh weather, or starvation. But a connected group could hunt together. Protect one another. Raise children together. Survive. Evolution rewarded cooperation. Not as an idea, but as biology. The brain slowly evolved chemical systems that encouraged people to stay close to those they trusted. It created a quiet message inside the nervous system. Stay close. This person matters. Don't lose them. At this point, there was still no romance. No marriage. No poetry. No soulmates. Only survival. Yet hidden inside that survival, something much greater was beginning to grow. Humans started developing preferences. Not every relationship felt the same. Certain people felt different. Safer. Warmer. More familiar. That preference wasn't logical. It wasn't planned. It was biological. Deep inside the brain, ancient reward systems were slowly encouraging stronger bonds between specific individuals. Those tiny changes would eventually inspire songs, stories, art, devotion. And even heartbreak. But none of that existed yet. For now. It was simply the first moment a human mind began caring. Just a little more. About one person than anyone else. And without realizing it, humanity had taken its first quiet step towards something the world would one day call love. At first, it wasn't love as we know it today. It was simply a feeling that refused to behave like every other instinct. One person felt different, not because they were the strongest. Not because they were the best hunter. Not because they possessed the most resources. But because being near them felt strangely comforting. Safer. Calmer. Important. Inside the brain, evolution was quietly building a new system. Not one designed for romance. But for survival. Whenever early humans stayed close to someone they trusted, their brains rewarded the behavior. Tiny bursts of dopamine created a sense of satisfaction. Oxytocin strengthened familiarity and trust. These chemicals didn't invent love. They simply encouraged people to stay connected. Over thousands of generations, those small rewards became powerful patterns. Imagine two early humans sitting beside a fire after surviving another dangerous day. They share food. They protect each other during the night. Nothing dramatic happens. But inside their brains, something remarkable is taking place. The nervous system begins connecting that person's presence with safety. Without words. Without conscious thought. The brain remembers. The next evening, they naturally choose to sit together again. Not because they planned it. Because it feels right. This is how evolution changes behavior. Not through sudden transformations. But through millions of tiny advantages repeated across countless generations. These growing bonds didn't just help individuals. They helped entire groups survive. Humans were never the fastest animals. They weren't the strongest either. Their greatest advantage was cooperation. Groups that trusted each other hunted more successfully. Protected children more effectively. Shared food more fairly. And survived longer. Evolution favored brains that encouraged connection. But something unexpected happened. The reward system became stronger than survival alone required. Humans no longer stayed close only because danger demanded it. They stayed close because closeness itself became rewarding. The feeling became valuable on its own. Slowly, the brain began treating certain people differently. One face stood out. One voice became familiar. One presence brought comfort that others could not. That quiet preference marked a turning point in human history. Because once the brain learned to reward closeness, it started seeking it. Again. And again, eventually, attachment became stronger than simple cooperation. It became personal. Specific. Selective. The seeds of loyalty were planted. The first hints of longing appeared. Even jealousy and heartbreak already existed in their earliest biological forms. Although no one yet had words to describe them. Hidden beneath every shared meal. Every dangerous night. Every quiet moment beside the fire. The human brain was slowly building something extraordinary. Not merely a strategy for survival. But the emotional foundation of every love story that would ever follow. As human brains became more advanced, something unexpected began to change. It wasn't the world outside. It was memory. Early humans didn't record their lives in books. They had no written language. No history. No way to preserve complex emotions with words. But their brains were already learning something remarkable. They no longer remembered only what happened. They began remembering who it happened with. Imagine surviving a freezing night beside someone you trusted. Together, you found food. Together, you escaped danger. Together, you watched the fire until sunrise. Nothing about that night seemed extraordinary. Yet inside the brain, a powerful association had formed. That person's face became linked with safety. Their voice became linked with calm. Their presence became part of what the brain considered normal. For the first time, security wasn't just a place. It was a person, and once the brain made that connection, everything changed. Because now, absence could be felt. If that familiar person wasn't nearby, something seemed slightly wrong. Not panic. Not terror. Just a quiet feeling that the world wasn't quite the way it should be. This was the beginning of selective attachment. Instead of treating every member of the group equally, the brain started assigning greater emotional importance to certain individuals. One person became different. More familiar. More comforting. More valuable. Without realizing it, early humans began choosing the same companions again and again. Not because they had to, but because their nervous systems preferred it. With repetition came expectation. The brain started predicting that certain people would always be there. And whenever that expectation failed, it produced discomfort. Today, we recognize this as a primitive form of separation anxiety. But for those early humans, it had no name. Only a feeling. Something was missing. That small discomfort became one of evolution's most powerful tools. It encouraged reunion, strengthened trust, rewarded closeness, and slowly reorganized human relationships around individuals instead of the group alone. This was a revolutionary shift. For millions of years, survival depended primarily on the tribe. Now, one person's presence could influence another person's emotional world. The brain had begun treating human connection as essential. Not because it understood love, but because evolution had discovered that strong emotional bonds made survival more likely. And without anyone noticing, the first foundations of emotional dependence had quietly taken root. What began as simple cooperation was becoming something far deeper. Something that would eventually shape every friendship, every family, every romance, and every broken heart in human history. At first, attachment was almost invisible. A quiet preference, a familiar face, a feeling of comfort that seemed impossible to explain. But evolution rarely leaves powerful emotions unchanged. Over thousands of generations, that simple preference grew stronger. When someone important walked away, the brain reacted differently than before. Not with hunger. Not with physical pain. But with a strange inner tension. The world suddenly felt less complete. And when that person returned, the tension disappeared. Relief washed through the body before the mind even understood why. The brain had begun tracking something entirely new. Not just presence, but absence. Distance itself now carried emotional weight. As these bonds deepened, another emotion quietly emerged. Jealousy. Not the jealousy we recognize today, but its earliest biological form. Imagine sitting beside someone who has become deeply familiar. Their presence calms you. Their attention feels rewarding. Then one day, they begin spending more time with someone else. Nothing has been taken from you. Yet something feels wrong. Your brain notices the change immediately. Because it has started treating that person as part of your emotional stability. Their attention now has value. When it shifts away, the nervous system responds as though something important has been lost. This wasn't about ownership. It was about survival. If a trusted partner became less available, protection, cooperation, and stability could disappear as well. So evolution encouraged behavior that restored closeness. People moved nearer, sought each other out, shared more time together, repeated familiar routines. Without understanding why. They were protecting relationships that had become emotionally important. This marked another extraordinary shift. Human behavior was no longer guided only by threats in the outside world. It was increasingly guided by emotions inside the brain. And internal emotions are incredibly powerful. Unlike predators or storms, they never truly disappear. The brain constantly predicts what should happen next. Who should be nearby? Who belongs within its circle of safety? When reality doesn't match those expectations, discomfort appears. That discomfort pushes us to reconnect. Again and again. Each reunion strengthens the bond. Each separation makes the next reunion even more meaningful. Over time, the relationship stops feeling optional. It becomes part of the brain's definition of normal life. Once that happens, fear of loss naturally follows. Because the brain now understands something it never understood before. The absence of one specific person can hurt. Not physically, but emotionally. And remarkably, emotional pain activates many of the same neural systems involved in physical pain. Even today, heartbreak can feel surprisingly real. Its roots stretch back to these ancient evolutionary systems. Long before poetry. Long before promises. Long before anyone spoke the word love. The human brain had already learned one unforgettable lesson. Some people become impossible to replace. And once that happens, life is never experienced in quite the same way again. As attachment grew stronger, evolution refined it. The human brain no longer formed the same bond with everyone. Instead, it began focusing on a single individual. Not because others had no value, but because one relationship became more reliable than the rest. This was the beginning of pair bonding. Not marriage. Not romance. Not culture. Something far older. A biological tendency to return to the same partner again and again. Scientists believe this shift offered a powerful survival advantage. Human children are born unusually helpless. They require years of care before they can survive on their own. One parent alone often struggled to provide enough food, protection, and attention. But when two adults stayed together, the chances of raising healthy children increased dramatically. Food could be gathered more consistently. Danger could be shared, responsibilities became lighter. From evolution's perspective, stable partnerships were simply more successful. So generation after generation, brains that encouraged lasting bonds became more common. But evolution created something far more powerful than it intended. The brain didn't separate survival from emotion. It blended them.
A relationship that began as practical slowly became deeply personal. This person helps me survive, quietly transformed into, I don't want to lose this person. With every shared experience, the connection deepened. Danger survived together became shared memory. Success became shared celebration. Comfort became shared expectation. Slowly, two lives began moving in the same direction. Neuroscientists now know that people who spend years together often influence each other's emotional responses. Their routines become synchronized. Their stress rises and falls together. Their sense of safety becomes linked. In a way, two separate nervous systems begin working as a team. That made separation feel increasingly difficult. Not simply because someone was gone, but because part of the brain's emotional stability disappeared with them. This was no longer just cooperation. It was emotional partnership. For the first time in evolutionary history, another individual became part of the brain's normal way of experiencing the world. And something extraordinary followed. Humans didn't just survive together anymore. They began imagining a future together, planning together, protecting each other even when immediate danger was gone. The bond itself had become valuable. Not only because it improved survival, but because it gave life a new kind of emotional meaning. Without realizing it, our ancestors had crossed another invisible threshold. Connection was no longer simply useful. It had become essential. And from that moment on, every generation inherited a brain increasingly wired to search for one thing above all else. Someone who felt like home. Once a bond became strong enough, distance stopped being just distance. It became an emotion. Earlier in human evolution, if someone walked away, life simply continued. But after thousands of years of stronger attachment, absence began to change the brain itself. The mind no longer saw separation as empty space. It experienced it as something missing. And the brain doesn't like missing pieces. It is constantly predicting what should happen next. Who should be nearby? Who belongs in its world? When those predictions fail, the brain tries to correct them. It searches. It remembers. It waits. This is where memory became one of love's greatest allies. For early humans, memory wasn't built for nostalgia. It was built for survival. The brain remembered the people who made life safer, the faces that brought comfort, the voices that signaled protection. Those memories became stronger than ordinary memories because emotion gives them priority. Even today, we remember emotional moments more clearly than ordinary ones. That ancient system still lives inside us. Soon, something remarkable happened. The brain no longer needed a person to be physically present. Could recreate them internally. A familiar face, a familiar voice, a shared moment beside a fire. Just remembering someone could calm the nervous system or make the absence feel even stronger. Modern neuroscience shows that the brain's reward system responds not only to rewards, but to the expectation of rewards. When someone important is away, the brain continues expecting their return. That expectation creates emotional tension. We call it longing. Longing is not simply missing someone. It is the brain trying to restore the emotional balance it has learned to expect. That is why reunion feels so powerful. The moment someone returns, the tension eases. The nervous system relaxes. The brain receives exactly what it had been predicting all along. Every cycle of separation and reunion strengthens the connection. Distance, longing, return, relief. Again and again, the relationship becomes more deeply woven into the brain. Eventually, another person is no longer just part of your environment. They become part of your emotional baseline. Without them, something feels incomplete. Not because you cannot survive alone, but because your brain has quietly rewritten its definition of normal. This may be one of evolution's greatest achievements. A survival system became an emotional system. An emotional system became part of identity. And that ancient transformation still shapes every human life today. Whenever you unexpectedly think about someone, whenever a familiar voice instantly brings comfort, whenever absence feels heavier than logic can explain, you are experiencing a mechanism that began hundreds of thousands of years ago. Long before civilization, long before history, long before anyone knew what to call it. The feeling remained the same, only the name changed. And eventually, humanity would call that feeling love. As emotional bonds became stronger, something more complicated began to appear. Not love, not yet, but something protective, possessive, reactive, jealousy. In its earliest form, jealousy was not about ownership. It was about emotional stability. Imagine early humans again, sitting in a small group around a fire. One person has become emotionally important to another. Their presence brings calm. Their attention feels meaningful. Then something changes. That attention shifts elsewhere. Even briefly, even harmlessly. But the brain reacts immediately, because attention is no longer neutral. It has emotional value. And when that value moves, the nervous system notices. Not through thought, but through feeling. Something feels wrong. Not dangerous in a physical sense, but unstable. This is where emotional exclusivity begins to form. The idea that one connection can feel more significant than others. Once that idea exists, comparison follows. Who is closer? Who receives more attention? Who matters more in the moment? These questions didn't exist in language yet, but they existed in behavior. People began moving closer, staying longer, competing silently for proximity. Not because they understood what they were doing, but because their nervous systems pushed them toward emotional security. And emotional security had become essential. At the same time, another shift was happening. The brain was categorizing relationships. Not everyone felt equal anymore. Some people became emotionally neutral. Others became important, and one became central. This created a hidden emotional hierarchy inside the group. And hierarchies always create tension, because attention cannot be shared evenly forever. Whenever it shifts, emotional imbalance appears, and the brain tries to restore balance the only way it knows how. By seeking closeness again. This cycle repeats. Distance, attention shift, emotional discomfort, reconnection, relief. Over time, this loop becomes powerful enough to shape behavior without conscious choice. What we now recognize as jealousy is simply the brain trying to protect a bond it has learned to depend on. But something deeper was also emerging. Humans were beginning to experience relationships not just as practical connections, but as emotional priorities. One person could now feel more important than the group. And that was a massive evolutionary shift. Because for most of human history, survival depended on collective unity. Now, survival decisions were being influenced by emotional attachment to individuals. This is where attachment crosses into meaning. A bond is no longer just useful. It becomes significant. And once something becomes significant, it begins to shape identity. People start to define themselves through connection. Not just, I am part of a group, but I belong with this person. This is the beginning of emotional exclusivity. And with exclusivity comes vulnerability. Because if one person becomes central to emotional stability, their absence becomes powerful. Their attention becomes necessary. Their presence becomes grounding. And suddenly, human connection is no longer simple cooperation. It is emotional dependency intertwined with survival instinct. And without anyone realizing it, the brain has crossed another invisible threshold. From bonding to meaning, from connection to importance, from survival to emotional truth. And this is where the story of love becomes irreversible. At some point in human history, something changed again. But this time it wasn't just biology. It was awareness. Humans were no longer only feeling attachment. They were beginning to notice it, to recognize it, to give it meaning. This was the moment emotional instinct began turning into emotional understanding. Instead of simply staying close to someone, early humans began realizing that closeness itself felt different, special, unusual, worth remembering. Two people could sit beside a fire and feel something neither of them had experienced before. Not spoken, not taught, but silently understood. This person matters to me, not as a group member, not as a survival partner, but as someone uniquely important. And once that recognition appeared, everything accelerated. Because awareness changes behavior, people began choosing each other intentionally, staying closer not only out of habit, but out of preference. Repetition became choice, and choice slowly became pattern. As human communication evolved, something even more powerful happened. These feelings began to be shared, not just experienced internally, but expressed externally. Through gestures, through behavior, through early forms of communication that eventually became language. What once existed only inside the brain, now existed between minds. And once something can be shared, can grow, can spread, can evolve. Over generations, these shared emotional patterns became rituals, repeated behaviors that strengthened bonds. And as language developed further, humans began naming what they felt. They tried to describe the invisible force pulling them together. They created words for attachment, for longing, for desire, for connection, and eventually, for love. But even after the word existed, the feeling remained unchanged. Because love was never created by language. Language only described what the brain had already been doing for thousands of years. Underneath culture, underneath society, underneath every story ever told, the same ancient system still works, rewarding closeness, punishing separation, strengthening memory, creating meaning from presence, and shaping the way humans experience each other. Today, thousands of years later, nothing fundamental has changed. Different cities, different technology, different lives, but the same brain, the same chemistry, the same longing, the same quiet pull toward someone who feels like home. So when someone becomes important to you, when their presence feels calming, when their absence feels heavy, when your mind returns to them without effort, it is not modern, it is not cultural, it is ancient. A system shaped long before civilization, before language, before history had names for anything. And maybe that is the most important truth of all. Love was never invented. It was discovered, slowly, quietly, inside the human mind. And once it appeared, it never left. Because humans didn't just learn how to survive. They learned how to bond. And eventually, they learned how to miss each other. And in that missing, They learned what it means to love.